The Morrison Associates building was one of those glass and steel monuments to corporate success that made me feel simultaneously intimidated and ambitious. At 24, fresh out of business school with my MBA and a mountain of student loans, I was determined to make my mark somewhere that mattered. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like ascending to my future, or at least I hoped it would be. The conference room was already half full when I arrived for new employee orientation, a mix of nervous-looking graduates like myself, and a few experienced hires who carried themselves with the casual confidence that came from knowing how these places worked. I chose a seat in the middle row, close enough to seem engaged, but not so close that I'd be called on first for anything. "Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Morrison & Associates." The voice that cut through the morning chatter was crisp, authoritative, and unmistakably female. I looked up to see a woman in her mid-30s striding to the front of the room with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was perfectly tailored, her dark hair pulled back in, a style that was professional but not severe. And when she turned to face us, her dark eyes swept across the room with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. "I'm Victoria Chen, Senior Marketing Director. I'll be giving you an overview of our marketing and client strategy division." There was something magnetic about the way she commanded the room. This wasn't someone reading from a script or going through the motions of corporate orientation. As she spoke about market analysis, client relationship management, and strategic consulting, I found myself genuinely engaged for the first time since arriving. She had a way of explaining complex concepts that made them feel not just understandable, but exciting. "Successful consulting isn't about having all the answers," she said, clicking to a slide that showed a complex market segmentation chart. "It's about asking the right questions and being willing to dig deeper when the obvious solutions don't work." Our eyes met for just a moment as she scanned the room. I felt something I couldn't quite name: recognition, maybe, or challenge. Like she was taking the measure of each person in the room and filing away her assessments for later use. After the presentation, we were given our team assignments. I watched as other new hires were distributed across various departments, some looking relieved, others disappointed. When my name was called for Victoria's strategic marketing team, I felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. "Good luck, man," said the guy sitting next to me, a recent graduate from Northwestern whose nameplate read Jamie. "I heard she's brilliant but demanding as hell. Choose up junior analysts for breakfast." "That's what I heard too," added a woman. From the back row, perfectionist to the core. She's made 3 people quit in the last year alone. But as I watched Victoria gathering her materials with the same precise efficiency she'd brought to her presentation, I didn't see someone to be afraid of. I saw someone who cared about the work, who had standards because she understood what excellence looked like. Maybe that made me naive, but I'd rather work for someone who pushed me to be better than someone who accepted mediocrity. The first few weeks at Morrison & Associates were a blur of learning new systems, understanding client relationships, and trying to prove I belonged there. Victoria's team consisted of 6 analysts, 2 senior associates, and Victoria herself. And I quickly learned that the warnings about her exacting standards were absolutely accurate. She reviewed every piece of work with a thoroughness that was initially terrifying, returning drafts with detailed notes written in her precise handwriting, probing questions that often revealed gaps in my analysis I hadn't even known existed. But here's what the people who called her demanding didn't understand. She was never cruel about it. When she returned my first market research report with 2 pages of notes, she also scheduled a 30-minute meeting to walk me through her feedback. When I struggled with a client presentation format, she sat down with examples from previous successful pitches and explained not just what to change, but why those changes would be more effective. I started staying late, not because I had to, but because I wanted to get things right. While other junior analysts would submit work that was good enough, I found myself spending extra hours perfecting charts, double-checking data, crafting executive summaries that anticipated questions before they were asked. It wasn't just about impressing Victoria, though I definitely wanted to do that. It was about living up to the standard she'd set. Around 8 o'clock one evening, 3 weeks into my tenure, I was alone in the break room, making what had to be my sixth cup of coffee that day when Victoria appeared in the doorway. "You're here late again," she observed, moving to the coffee machine with the same measured efficiency she brought to everything. "Just finishing up the Henderson Industries analysis," I said, suddenly aware that my tie was loosened and my sleeves were rolled up. Victoria, by contrast, looked as composed as she had at 9 that morning. "How do you take your coffee?" she asked, holding up a second mug. "Black. I figure if I'm going to drink this much of it, I should at least taste what I'm consuming." That earned me the hint of a smile, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her outside of work contexts. Smart philosophy. I've never understood people who load it with cream and sugar until it tastes like dessert. We stood there for a moment, in comfortable silence, both of us cradling our mugs of coffee that was probably strong enough to power machinery. "The Henderson analysis," she said finally. "What's your take on their market positioning?" And just like that, we were talking about work again, but it felt different somehow. Less formal, more collaborative. Victoria asked questions that made me think harder about my conclusions. When I presented a perspective she hadn't considered, I caught something that might have been approval in her expression. "I should head home," she said eventually, checking her watch. "My ex-husband used to complain that I lived at the office. Turned out he was right about some things." It was said lightly, almost as an afterthought, but I caught the brief shadow that crossed her face. For just a moment, the polished professional facade slipped, and I saw something vulnerable underneath someone who maybe questioned whether dedication to work had cost her things she valued. "For what it's worth," I said, "I think caring about doing good work is admirable, not something to apologize for." Victoria looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's a very generous perspective, Ethan." The sound of my name in her voice, spoken with something warmer than professional courtesy, stayed with me long after she'd gathered her things and headed for the elevator. Over the following weeks, our late evening encounters became more frequent. Victoria would emerge from her office around the time most people were heading home and find me still working at my desk or in one of the small conference rooms. Sometimes she'd ask about my projects, offering insights that invariably improved my work. Other times, we'd end up in conversations that started professional but drifted toward more personal territory, her observations about client psychology, my thoughts on market trends we'd studied in business school, shared frustrations with colleagues who seemed to coast on minimum effort. The big break came with the Meridian Corp presentation. It was our team's most important pitch of the quarter, potential multi-million-dollar consulting contract that everyone in the company was watching. Victoria had been working on it for weeks, and she'd assigned me to handle the market analysis. A significant responsibility for someone with barely 2 months at the firm. I knew this was my chance to prove I belonged on her team, and I threw everything I had into it. I stayed until nearly midnight for 3 straight days, cross-referencing industry data, building comprehensive competitive analyses, creating visual presentations that told a clear story about Meridian's market position and growth opportunities. I wanted every chart perfect, every data point verified, every conclusion supported by evidence that would withstand the most skeptical questioning. On the night before the presentation, most of the team had gone home by 6, confident that we were as prepared as we could be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my analysis could be stronger, more comprehensive. So I stayed, refining charts and rehearsing my portions of the presentation until the words felt natural rather than memorized. It was just past 9 when I heard the soft sound of heels in the hallway. I looked up from my laptop to see Victoria walking toward my desk, her jacket draped over her arm and her hair slightly less perfect than it had been that morning. "You've been staying late for me lately," she said, stopping beside my desk with an expression that seemed to contain layers I couldn't read. The words hung in the air between us. I felt something shift in the atmosphere. There was her literal meaning. I had been staying late to perfect work for her team, for her standards. But the way she said it, the slight emphasis on certain words, suggested something else entirely. "I don't mind if you're here," I replied. Meeting her eyes directly, the silence that followed felt charged with electricity. I could see Victoria processing my response, realizing as I was that we just had two conversations simultaneously, one about work schedules and dedication, and another about something much more personal. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw surprise there, and something that might have been interest. "Well," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled, "dedication to excellence is always appreciated. Make sure you get some rest before tomorrow's presentation. Of course. Good night, Victoria. Good night, Ethan." As she walked toward the elevator, I could feel the weight of what had just passed between us. Maybe I was reading too much into a simple exchange about working late. Maybe the tension I felt was just the product of stress and too much caffeine and the pressure of tomorrow's presentation. But as I packed up my things and prepared to finally head home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us. The way she looked at me when I said I didn't mind if she was there, it wasn't the look you give a junior employee. It was the look you give someone when you're realizing they might mean more to you than they should. I spent the elevator ride down wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, if professional respect and late-night exhaustion had combined to create tension where none existed. But even as I tried to rationalize it away, I knew something had changed. Tomorrow's presentation suddenly felt like more than just a career opportunity. It felt like the beginning of something I wasn't sure either of us was ready to acknowledge. The question was whether Victoria felt it too, or if I was about to make the biggest professional mistake of my very short career. The Meridian presentation was a success, better than a success. Actually, our team landed the contract, and my market analysis was specifically praised by the client's CEO. But what I remembered most about that day wasn't the congratulations from senior partners or the celebratory drinks afterward. It was the moment when Victoria caught my eye across the conference room and gave me the smallest nod of approval, a look that said she'd known I could deliver. In the weeks that followed, our late evening encounters shifted from coincidental to almost routine. Victoria would finish her day around the time most people were heading home, and instead of leaving immediately, she'd find reasons to check on projects, review materials, or simply walk through the office. I'd started timing my own schedule to overlap with these moments, telling myself it was about learning from her expertise, while knowing it was something more. The break room became our unofficial meeting space. It was neutral territory removed. From the hierarchy of her corner office, where conversations could drift beyond purely professional boundaries without feeling like they were crossing lines. "Do you ever get tired of having to prove yourself over and over again?" Victoria asked one evening as we stood by the coffee machine, both of us holding mugs that had gone lukewarm while we talked. The question caught me off guard in its directness. "What do you mean, today's client meeting? Did you notice how Peterson kept directing questions about your analysis to me instead of asking you directly?" She leaned against the counter, her usual composed posture, relaxing slightly. "You did the work. You know the material better than anyone, but he assumed you were too junior to have real insights." I had noticed, actually, but I'd chalked it up to normal corporate hierarchy. "I figured that's just how these things work when you're new." "It's not about being new," Victoria said, something sharp entering her voice. "I've been doing this for 8 years, Ethan. I have an MBA from Wharton and a track record that speaks for itself. I still have male colleagues who speak over me in meetings or ask if I'm sure about my recommendations. They assume my success is somehow accidental, that I'm not really the one making the strategic decisions." There was frustration there, but also wariness, the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting the same battle for years. I'd never thought about what it must be like for Victoria, being one of only 3 female directors in a company dominated by men in expensive suits, who'd grown up assuming the world would make space for them. "For what it's worth," I said, "everyone on our team knows you're the smartest person in the room. Hell, everyone in the company knows it." Victoria's smile was rueful. Being smart isn't always enough. Sometimes I think about how much energy I spend just trying to be taken seriously, energy I could be putting into actual work. "I know the feeling," I said, surprising myself with the admission. "Different reasons, but I know what it's like to feel like you have to work twice as hard. To get half the credit? Because of your age? Because of everything? The youngest person on every team I'm assigned to. I look young for 24. I don't have years of industry experience to point to. And sometimes I catch people looking at me like they're wondering if I'm someone's nephew who got hired as a favor. I paused, realizing I'd never articulated these insecurities out loud before. I spend a lot of time trying to prove I deserve to be here. Victoria studied my face with an intensity that made me suddenly self-conscious. You know what I see when I look at your work? What? Someone who thinks differently than everyone else in this building? You don't just analyze data, you understand what it means, what story it's telling. That Henderson Industries report you did last month? I've been doing this for 8 years, and I wouldn't have thought to cross-reference their market position with demographic shifts in their target regions. That kind of insight isn't something you can teach. The sincerity in her voice was almost overwhelming. I'd been so focused on proving myself that I hadn't realized someone was already seeing value in what I brought to the table. Thank you, I said, and meant it more than she probably realized. We're both outsiders here, Victoria said quietly. Maybe that's why we end up having the best conversations when everyone else has gone home. What began as informal late night discussions evolved into something more structured over the following weeks. Victoria started scheduling one-on-one meetings with me, ostensibly to discuss my professional development and review my project work. These sessions took place in her office with the door closed, standard practice for confidential discussions about performance and strategy. But the privacy created an intimacy that made every interaction feel more significant. Client management is about reading people as much as presenting data, Victoria explained during one of these sessions, standing close enough to me that I could catch the subtle scent of her perfume as we reviewed a presentation deck together. Look at this slide, the information is accurate. But the visual presentation doesn't match how this particular client processes information. She reached across me to point to a chart on my laptop screen, her arm brushing against mine in a way that sent electricity through me. If she noticed the contact, she gave no indication, maintaining her professional focus while I struggled to concentrate on her words rather than her proximity. See how they responded during the Henderson meeting? She continued. They're visual. Learners who need to see relationships between data points rather than just reading numbers in a table. Your analysis is brilliant, but the presentation needs to match their cognitive style. These moments of physical closeness became more frequent as our mentoring sessions progressed. Victoria would stand behind my chair while I worked on my laptop, her hand occasionally resting on the back of my seat as she pointed out improvements. When she handed me documents, her fingers would brush mine for just a moment longer than necessary. When we reviewed materials printed on paper, we'd sit side by side at her conference table, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence. The rational part of my mind insisted this was normal mentoring behavior, that successful executives often took personal interest in developing promising junior staff. But there was something in the way Victoria looked at me during these sessions of focus that went beyond professional assessment. It's an attention that felt personal rather than purely educational. You're learning quickly, she said one afternoon. As we finished reviewing a client strategy proposal, it's much more quickly than most people at your level. I have a good teacher, I replied, and the way her eyes lingered on mine suggested she heard more in that statement than professional gratitude. Dude, what have you been doing differently? Jamie asked as we grabbed lunch from the cafeteria on a Friday afternoon. Your work has gotten insanely good over the past month. I tried to play it off casually while internally panicking that someone had noticed. Just getting more comfortable with the systems, I guess. No, it's more than that. That market segmentation analysis you presented yesterday, I think that was senior associate level work, maybe higher. Jamie leaned forward conspiratorially. And have you noticed that Victoria gives you way better projects than the rest of us? Peterson and Sarah are still doing basic data entry while you're working on actual strategy development. The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. I'd been getting more complex, interesting assignments lately, and Victoria had been involving me in client meetings that other junior analysts didn't attend. Maybe she just thinks I can handle more responsibility, I said weakly. Maybe she's got a thing for you, Jamie said with a grin that made my stomach drop. I'm kidding, man, but seriously, you're like the teacher's pet over there. Victoria barely acknowledges the rest of us exist, but she's constantly giving you feedback and special training sessions. It's just professional development, I said, but even to my own ears it sounded defensive. Hey, I'm not complaining. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Just don't forget us little people when you're running the place. Later that afternoon, Jamie cornered me again with a different agenda. Speaking of your mysterious transformation, when's the last time you went on a date? What does that have to do with anything? You've been so focused on work lately, I'm worried you're turning into a monk. Sarah from reception was asking about you yesterday. Thinks you're cute but too serious. I could set something up if you want. The suggestion made me more uncomfortable than it should have. 6 months ago, I would have jumped at the chance to date someone like Sarah, attractive, fun, age-appropriate. Now, the idea felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain without admitting truths I wasn't ready to voice. I'm not really looking to date anyone right now, I said. It's too focused on getting established here. That's exactly what I'm talking about, man. All work and no play makes Ethan a very dull boy. Jamie studied my face with the persistence of someone who'd known me since orientation. There's got to be someone you're interested in. Come on, Spill, if only he knew. If Jamie had any idea that the someone I was interested in was our boss, someone 10 years older than us, someone whose professional attention had evolved into something that felt increasingly personal, he'd probably think I'd lost my mind. Well, maybe I had lost my mind. Just not the right time, I said finally. And thankfully, Jamie let it drop. Saturday afternoon found me at the office, catching up on a project that had been pushed aside during the week's client meetings. The building was mostly empty, just a few workaholics like myself and the security guard making his rounds. I'd expected to have the place to myself, which is why I was surprised to hear voices coming from Victoria's offices. I passed by on my way to the break room. Through her partially open door, I could see Victoria on a phone call, her usually composed demeanor replaced by visible stress. Her voice was tense, professional, but strained, and I caught fragments of what sounded like a difficult conversation with a client. I understand your concerns, but the timeline you're suggesting isn't realistic for the level of analysis you've requested. Yes, I'm aware of the budget constraints. No, I don't think you're being unreasonable, but I need you to understand. I hesitated in the hallway, not wanting to eavesdrop, but also not wanting to abandon Victoria if she was dealing with a crisis. When the call ended, I heard what sounded like frustration, a sharp exhale, followed by silence. I knocked gently on her doorframe. Victoria? Everything okay? She looked up, and I was startled by how defeated she appeared. Her hair was slightly mussed, her jacket was draped over her chair instead of hanging properly, and there were stress lines around her eyes that I'd never noticed before. Ethan. I didn't realize anyone else was here. She tried to compose herself, straightening papers on her desk with movements that seemed more frantic than organized. Client trouble? I asked, stepping into her office. The Jameson Group. They want to completely overhaul the scope of work 3 weeks into the project, without adjusting the timeline or budget. It's basically asking us to do twice the work for them. Same money in half the time. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. And somehow, it's my fault for not anticipating their evolving needs. That's completely unreasonable. Is it? Victoria's voice cracked slightly. Maybe I should have seen this coming. Maybe I'm not as good at reading clients as I thought. Maybe my ex-husband was right. Maybe I'm so focused on the work that I missed the human element entirely. The mention of her divorce, combined with the vulnerability in her voice, made something protective rise in my chest. This wasn't the composed, confident Victoria I knew. This was someone questioning everything about herself because one difficult client was making unreasonable demands. Victoria, no. That's not. You're one of the most perceptive people I've ever met. The way you read the Henderson Industries team during our presentation. How you knew exactly what Peterson needed to hear to sign on. That's not someone who misses the human element. Then why does it feel like I keep failing at this? She asked. And I realized she wasn't just talking about client management. I moved closer to her desk, abandoning any pretense of maintaining professional distance. You're not failing at anything. You're dealing with an unreasonable client who's trying to take advantage of your professionalism. Sometimes I wonder if this is all I'm good at, she said quietly. Work. Building strategies and managing clients. And hitting targets. Maybe that's why my marriage fell apart. Maybe this is all I know how to do successfully. That's not true, isn't it? I'm 34 years old, divorced, and I spend Saturday afternoons at the office because I don't have anywhere else I'd rather be? What does that say about my life? The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. Without thinking about professional boundaries or appropriate behavior, I reached out and touched her hand. It says you care about doing good work. It says you have standards and you're not willing to compromise them. And it says you're dedicated to something bigger than yourself. I paused, meeting her eyes. For what it's worth, I'd rather be here working with you than anywhere else doing anything else. Victoria looked down at where my hand covered hers, and neither of us moved to break the contact. The air in her office felt charged with something we'd both been trying to ignore for weeks. "Ethan," she said softly, "we shouldn't." The sound of a vacuum cleaner starting up in the hallway made us both jump, breaking whatever spell had been building between us. Victoria pulled her hand back, and I stepped away from her desk, both of us suddenly hyper-aware of what had almost happened. I started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Yes, you should probably go," Victoria said, but her voice was gentle rather than dismissive. "Thank you for listening. I didn't mean to... You don't need to apologize for being human," I said. "We all have moments when things feel overwhelming." As I gathered my things to leave, I caught Victoria watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something deeper, more complicated. We'd crossed a line today, both of us offering and accepting comfort that went beyond professional courtesy. The question was what we were going to do about it. The call came on a Wednesday morning. Meridian Corp wanted an in-person follow-up meeting to discuss expanding our contract. The catch was that their headquarters was in Philadelphia, a 4-hour drive that would require an overnight stay. "I'll need someone from the team to come with me," Victoria announced during our weekly meeting. "This is potentially a significant expansion of our relationship with them. So I want our best analyst there to handle any detailed questions about market projections." She didn't look at me when she said it, but I felt the weight of selection anyway. An hour later, Jamie confirmed what I'd suspected. "Congratulations, teacher's pet," he said with a grin that held only mild envy. "Philadelphia with the boss. That's got to be good for your career trajectory." The drive to Philadelphia should have been awkward, for hours alone in Victoria's BMW. Professional boundaries maintained while confined in a small space. Instead, it was one of the most comfortable conversations I'd ever had. We talked about everything from market trends to favorite books to travel experiences. It's the kind of wide-ranging discussion that revealed layers of personality usually hidden beneath professional roles. "I've always wanted to see New Zealand," Victoria said as we crossed into Pennsylvania. "Something about the landscape, it seems like a place where you could disappear from the world for a while and remember what matters." "Running away from something?" I asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too personal. "Maybe running toward something instead," she said, glancing at me briefly before returning her attention to the highway. "Sometimes I think about what my life would look like if I made different choices. Less focused on climbing ladders, more focused on ... experiences that matter." The hotel was a mid-range business place near Meridian's offices, the kind of establishment designed for traveling professionals who needed comfortable beds and reliable Wi-Fi more than luxury amenities. We checked in separately, were assigned rooms on the same floor, and agreed to meet for dinner to review our presentation materials one final time. The Meridian meeting the next morning went even better than we'd hoped. We were impressed with our follow-up analysis and committed to expanding our contract by nearly 40%. Victoria was brilliant during the presentation, articulate, persuasive, demonstrating exactly why she'd earned her position despite the challenges she faced. As a woman in a male-dominated industry, "Celebratory drink," Victoria suggested as we packed up our materials. There was a bar in the hotel that looked decent. The hotel bar was dimly lit and sparsely populated. It's the kind of place where business travelers could decompress after successful meetings. We found a quiet table in the corner and ordered wine, something Victoria selected with the confidence of someone who understood what made a good vintage. "That was masterful," I said, raising my glass. "The way you handled Peterson's questions about long-term scalability, I learned more about client management in 2 hours than I did in 4 years of business school." "You weren't bad yourself," Victoria replied. "Your market analysis was spot on, and you presented it with real authority. 2 months ago, you never would have been that confident in a room full of senior executives." I had a good teacher. The words hung between us, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Victoria's eyes met mine across the small table, and I saw something there that made my pulse quicken. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Anything." I look forward to our late-night conversations more than I probably should. When I'm driving home after one of those evenings when we end up talking in the break room, I feel more alive than I have in years. The confession was so honest, so vulnerable, that it took my breath away. Victoria ... I know it's complicated. I know there are a dozen reasons why this is probably a bad idea. But I need you to know that what's happening between us isn't just in my head. It's not in your head, I said quietly. I've learned more from you in 3 months than I learned from anyone else in my entire life. Not just about work, about everything. About what it means to have standards, to care about excellence, to be the kind of person worth knowing. Finished our wine in a silence that felt charged with possibility rather than awkwardness. When we finally left the bar, the elevator ride to our floor felt interminable, both of us hyper-aware of the other's presence in the small space. "Well," Victoria said as we reached her door. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Victoria." But neither of us moved. We stood there in the hallway, key cards in our hands. Both of us knowing that walking into our separate rooms would mean pretending this conversation hadn't happened. That the tension building between us for weeks was purely professional. "Sweet dreams," Victoria said finally, her voice softer than usual. "You too?" I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling of my hotel room and thinking about everything Victoria had said. It's about feeling alive during our conversations. About the complications we were both aware of but seemed powerless to avoid. Somewhere down the hall, I wondered if she was lying awake too, processing the same thoughts, wrestling with the same questions about what came next. By morning, we'd both retreated into professional roles, discussing the drive back to the city and follow-up tasks for the Meridian expansion. But something fundamental had shifted between us during that conversation in the hotel bar. We'd acknowledged what was happening, given it words, made it real. The question now was what we were going to do about it. The week following our Philadelphia trip was torture. Victoria and I moved around each other with the careful politeness of people, pretending that nothing had changed, that we hadn't shared something profound in that hotel bar. She was scrupulously professional, reviewing my work with the same thoroughness as always, but without the lingering glances or casual touches that had become part of our routine. I found myself overcompensating in the opposite direction, staying later than necessary not to see her, but to avoid the awkward dance of leaving at the same time. By Friday, I couldn't take it anymore. "Could I schedule some time with you next week?" I asked, stopping by her office with what I hoped looked like casual professional interest. I wanted to discuss some career development questions. Victoria looked up from her computer, and for just a moment, her professional mask slipped. I saw relief there, or maybe recognition, like she'd been waiting for this conversation as much as I had. Of course, Monday evening, around 7, Monday evening arrived with all the weight of an appointment that would change everything. Victoria's office felt different after hours, more intimate somehow, with the rest of the building quiet and the city lights beginning to twinkle beyond her windows. "So," she said, settling into the chair across from her conference table rather than behind her desk, "career development. Victoria, I need to be honest with you." The words came out in a rush. "This isn't really about career development. I mean, it is, but not in the way either of us is pretending." She was very still, watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. "I think about you constantly," I continued. "Not just about work, not just about what you've taught me professionally, but about you. About the way you laugh when something genuinely surprises you. About how you get this little line between your eyebrows when you're concentrating. About that moment in the hotel bar when you told me our conversations make you feel alive." Victoria closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, the professional distance was gone entirely. "Ethan, I've never felt the kind of intellectual connection with anyone that I feel with you. Not with my ex-husband, not with any of the men I've dated since my divorce. You challenge me. You make me think about things differently. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "You make me remember why I fell in love with this work in the first place. But But you know as well as I do that this violates every policy this company has about workplace relationships. I'm your supervisor. There's an inherent power dynamic that makes this complicated at best, potentially damaging to both our careers. At worst, I know. And the age difference. I'm 24, not 14. I'm a consenting adult who's capable of making his own decisions about who he wants to be with. Victoria stood up, moving to the window with her back to me. People will assume I'm taking advantage of you, that you're sleeping with me to advance your career. Neither of those things is true, but perception becomes reality in corporate environments. Then we don't let it become perception. She turned to face me then, and I could see the internal battle playing out in her expression, professional caution, warring with something deeper and more personal. Come here, she said softly. I stood up, moving to where she stood by the window. Victoria pulled out a folder from her briefcase, my performance reviews. My project assessments, documentation of my professional development over the past 4 months. Your career trajectory, she said, opening the folder between us. Officially, that's what we're discussing. But as she spread the papers on the conference table, I could feel the electricity in the small space between us. When she pointed to a particular evaluation, I moved closer, close enough to smell her perfume, close enough to see the rapid pulse in her throat. Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria. I reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and cupped her face in my hand. Do you feel this too? Instead of answering with words, she leaned into my touch, her eyes closing as my thumb traced along her cheekbone. We can't undo this once we cross this line, she said, but she was moving closer even as she spoke. I don't want to undo it. When our lips met, it was with months of suppressed tension and careful restraint finally being released. Victoria kissed me with a control born from experience, but there was nothing calculated about it, just genuine desire and connection that had been building since that first night she'd commented on my coffee preferences. I kissed her back with all the sincerity and gentleness I could manage, trying to convey without words that this wasn't casual for me, that she wasn't just an attractive older woman or a career opportunity, but someone I genuinely cared about. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard.
That was...
Victoria started. Worth it? I finished. She smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression I'd seen from her in a week. Yes, it was worth it. We have to be careful, Victoria said, as we sat on her office couch, the performance review papers forgotten. On the conference table, more careful than either of us has probably ever had to be about anything. I know. Like separate cars to work. No personal conversations in the office. No emails or text messages that could be misconstrued, if anyone suspects. Anything, it could destroy both our careers. What about outside the office? Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering. My condo is downtown, away from anyone we work with. If we're careful about timing, about being seen together, ... Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that I'm tired of pretending. I don't care about you. If you're willing to navigate the complications, then maybe we can figure out how to make this work. Victoria's downtown condo was a revelation, sleek and modern, like her office, but warmer, more personal. Photographs from her travels, books that revealed interests beyond work, a kitchen that looked actually used rather than merely decorative. Wine? She asked, and I watched her select a bottle with the same care she brought to everything else. I should probably warn you that my wine knowledge extends to red and white. Then consider this part of your education. Over the following weeks, Victoria's condo became our sanctuary. She taught me about wine, took me to restaurants I never would have discovered on my own, introduced me to art galleries and cultural events that expanded my understanding of the city we both lived in. In return, I brought energy to her carefully structured world, convinced her to try food trucks, to take walks through neighborhoods she'd never explored, to find joy in spontaneous moments. Our physical relationship developed with the same thoughtful progression as everything else between us. Victoria approached intimacy with patience and attention, teaching me things about connection and pleasure that had nothing to do with urgency or conquest. I brought sincerity and wonder to moments that felt sacred in their intensity. I never expected this, Victoria said one Sunday morning, as we lay in her bed, city light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. What? This feeling. Like I've been waiting my whole life for someone to really see me, and I didn't even know I was waiting. I propped myself up on my elbow to look at her. I see you. All of you. I know you do. That's what makes this so terrifying, and so wonderful at the same time. As I held her in the quiet morning light, I realized we'd found something neither of us had been looking for, a connection that transcended professional mentorship or physical attraction. Something that felt essential and irreplaceable. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever complications we'd have to navigate, this feeling was worth protecting, even if we had to hide it from everyone else. Even if we had to exist in the spaces between other people's expectations, what we'd found together felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. By October, 4 months into our carefully hidden relationship, the strain of maintaining our professional facade was becoming increasingly difficult. Every interaction at work required conscious performance, measuring the length of our conversations, monitoring our body language, ensuring that Victoria's mentorship of me appeared consistent with her treatment of other junior staff. The most challenging moment came during my 6-month performance review. Victoria sat across from me in her office, the door open as required by company policy, discussing my professional development with the same measured tone she used for all formal evaluations. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she avoided my eyes as she read from the assessment form. "Your analytical skills have shown marked improvement," she said, her voice professionally neutral. "Your client presentation abilities have developed beyond expectations for someone at your level." What she couldn't say was that many of those improvements had come from our private conversations. From the hours we spent discussing strategy and client psychology in the sanctuary of her condo, she was being scrupulously fair, if anything, slightly harder on me than she might have been to avoid any appearance of favoritism. But the careful distance required by the evaluation process felt like a betrayal of the intimacy we'd built.
"Oh, Jamie's
Been asking questions?" I told Victoria that evening as we sat on her couch sharing a bottle of wine. "He keeps commenting on how much my work has improved, wondering what my secret is." "What do you tell him?" "That I've been studying industry, publications, taking online courses," which is technically true, but ... double quotes, but not the whole truth. Victoria's expression was troubled. "We're going to have to be even more careful. People are starting to notice patterns. The close calls were becoming more frequent. The previous week, we'd nearly been spotted having dinner at a restaurant downtown when Peterson from senior management had walked in with clients. Victoria had excused herself to the bathroom while I'd pretended to be absorbed in my phone until they were seated, far enough away to not notice us. The entire evening had been ruined by the constant vigilance. Required to avoid detection, the holiday season brought its own set of challenges. My parents, during their Thanksgiving visit, had peppered me with questions about my personal life that I deflected with increasing awkwardness. "You're working too hard, honey," my mother had said as we cleaned up after dinner. "You need to find a nice girl. Settle down. You're 24 by your age. Your father and I were already engaged." "I'm focusing on my career right now, Mom." "Work isn't everything, Ethan. Don't let ambition keep you from finding someone special." If only she knew that I had found someone special, someone brilliant and beautiful and complex. Someone who challenged me intellectually and supported me emotionally. But Victoria was also someone my parents would never understand. It's someone whose age and position would immediately trigger their protective instincts and conservative assumptions about appropriate relationships. Victoria faced similar pressure from her social circle. Her college friends, mostly married with children, had begun making pointed comments about her reluctance to date. "There are plenty of successful, attractive men our age," her friend Lisa had said during a wine night that Victoria had reluctantly attended. "You can't let one bad marriage keep you from putting yourself out there again." The company holiday party represented our biggest challenge yet. We spent days choreographing our attendance, arriving separately, maintaining careful distance, ensuring we were never photographed together or seen in prolonged conversation. Watching Victoria from across the room, elegant in a dark blue dress that made her eyes look almost midnight, not being able to acknowledge that she was the most important person in my world, felt like a special kind of torture. Despite the challenges, there was something profoundly satisfying about our hidden relationship. Victoria's downtown condo had become more than just a place to meet. It had become our world, a space where we could exist as ourselves without the careful performance required everywhere else. Tell me about the building you'd design if money and zoning weren't considerations. Victoria said one Sunday morning as we read the paper in bed, her head on my shoulder. Why architecture? Because you get this look when you talk about design. About how spaces can influence how people feel. I want to understand what you see when you look at buildings. These conversations about dreams and fears and ideas that had nothing to do with work had become the foundation of our relationship. Victoria was genuinely interested in my thoughts, not as a junior employee she was mentoring, but as someone whose perspective she valued. In return, she shared parts of herself she'd kept hidden from colleagues and even friends, her insecurity about being taken seriously, her fear that professional success had come at the cost of personal fulfillment, her dreams of traveling too, places where no one knew her reputation. I never had this with my ex-husband, she admitted one evening as we cooked dinner together. We talked about practical things, schedules, finances, social obligations, but never about ideas, about what we wanted from life beyond the next milestone. What did you want that he couldn't give you? This, she said, gesturing to the space. Between us, someone who listens not just to respond, but to understand. Someone who makes me think about familiar things in new ways. The conversation that changed everything happened on a quiet Sunday morning in December. We were drinking coffee and reading, the kind of comfortable domesticity that felt natural despite the unusual circumstances of our relationship. Can I ask you something? Victoria said, setting down her book. Always. Do you ever think about what this looks like long term? What we're building together? It was a question we'd both been avoiding. The elephant in the room that made planning beyond the next week feel impossible. Honestly, I try not to think too far ahead because it makes me panic about all the things that could go wrong. You did think about it? Set down my coffee, considering how to articulate something I'd been feeling but hadn't put into words. I think about the possibility that some relationships don't fit into conventional categories. That maybe what we have is valuable enough to exist on its own terms, even if we can never make it public. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking the same thing. This might never be something we can announce to the world, introduce at company parties, share with our families. But that doesn't make it less real or less important. Are you okay with that? 6 months ago, I thought I was destined to spend the rest of my life alone, going through the motions of work and social obligations without any real connection to another person. You changed that. You made me remember what it feels like to be excited about coming home to someone, to have thoughts worth sharing, to feel genuinely known by another human being. Even if we have to hide it? Even if we have to hide it. What we have together is more authentic than most conventional relationships I've observed. We chose each other knowing the complications, knowing the sacrifices required. That makes it precious, not diminished. The office was nearly empty by 7 p.m. on a Thursday in late December, just me and a few other dedicated workaholics putting finishing touches on year-end presentations. I was deep into analysis for a client pitch when Jamie stopped by my desk, jacket in hand and ready to head home. Working late again, I see, he said with good-natured exasperation. Dude, you've turned into a machine this year. The work you presented to the Peterson Group last week was insane, like senior associate level stuff. Just trying to stay sharp, I said, minimizing the spreadsheet I'd been working on. Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. Word around the office is that you're on the fast track for promotion. Victoria's been singing your praises to senior management. After Jamie left, I sat alone in the quiet office, reflecting on how much had changed since my first day 8 months ago. The nervous, eager-to-please graduate who'd walked into Morrison Associates had evolved into someone confident in his abilities, secure in his value to the team, comfortable with complex challenges that would have intimidated him before. The sound of heels on marble made me look up. Victoria emerged from her office, briefcase in hand, looking as composed as she had at 9 that morning. For anyone watching, this was simply a director finishing her day, while a dedicated junior analyst continued working late. How's the Morrison Industries analysis coming along? She asked, stopping by my desk with professional interest. Nearly finished. I should have the full report ready for review tomorrow morning. Excellent. Make sure you get some rest. Tomorrow's presentation is important. It was a completely ordinary professional exchange, the kind of conversation that happened hundreds of times each day throughout the building. But as Victoria turned to leave, our eyes met for just a moment, a brief acknowledgement of everything that existed beneath the surface of our careful performance. She gave me the smallest smile, barely perceptible unless you knew to look for it, before heading toward the elevators. As I watched her go, I realized I'd learned something profound over the past 8 months. Professional success was satisfying, but it paled in comparison to the feeling of being truly known by someone whose opinion mattered to you. Conventional wisdom suggested that mixing personal and professional relationships was dangerous. That workplace romances inevitably ended in disaster. Maybe that was true for some people. But Victoria and I had found something that transcended typical categories: a connection built on genuine respect, intellectual compatibility, and the kind of trust that could only develop between people who saw each other clearly and chose to stay anyway. I'd learned not just about market analysis and client management, but about the courage required to pursue authentic connection, even when it didn't fit society's prescribed patterns. Some relationships existed in quiet spaces, away from public scrutiny, but that didn't make them less meaningful. Sometimes the most important connections happened in the margins, protected by discretion and sustained by the recognition that what you'd found together was worth whatever sacrifices were required to preserve it. As I packed up my work for the evening, I felt grateful for the unexpected education I'd received, not just in business strategy, but in the complexity of human connection and the profound satisfaction of being loved, not for who I was supposed to be, but for who I actually was.